Before we begin, we continue to daven that our learning should be a zechut for all of our chayalim. We just heard the news that a couple of soldiers were killed yesterday, unfortunately, in an attack in Gaza, and we continue to daven that God should protect our soldiers, should bring back our chatufim, should heal all those who are injured, and should give our leaders the wisdom to make the correct decisions moving forward. Be'ezrat Hashem. So the truth is that last week's class, some of the questions that you raised pointed me in a little bit of a different direction in terms of what we're going to discuss today than I had originally planned. Last week we talked about Al Hanisim, and we did a little bit of an analysis of Al Hanisim and developed the theory that one of the major themes, or perhaps the major theme of Chanukah, is that of Hallel v'Hoda'ah, about giving thanks to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and we saw aspects of that in the way that Al Hanisim is formulated and developed, and on how in Chazal Chanukah is called Yemei Hallel v'Hoda'ah, and we say often the phrase Lehodot u'Lehalel is very much a part of the liturgy of Chanukah, and how that perhaps is because that's what Chanukah is really all about. It's a time of thanks, and perhaps it's the prototypical Chag of thanks. And as part of that discussion, a couple of you raised a question regarding the historical authorship of Al Hanisim, and at the time I didn't have much to answer you because I hadn't done the proper research on that, but it got me thinking, and as a result of looking into that a little bit, I came to see other themes and other important things about Al Hanisim that I thought were very meaningful to discuss. So we're going to spend some more time talking about Al Hanisim, new ideas that I found in Al Hanisim that I think are very meaningful to discuss, and also we're going to touch upon one of the other tefillot that we say, which is the tefillah of haneret halalu that we say right after we light the candles. So we're going to start with Al Hanisim. We're not going to go through Al Hanisim again. We did that last week. We went through it all word by word. But what I wanted to discuss was, number one, where does Al Hanisim come from? The authorship of Al Hanisim. It's not 100% clear, but I did bring for you a number of different sources where the authorship and the description of Al Hanisim does start to begin. And interestingly enough, there's a fascinating debate that is developed very early on regarding the text of Al Hanisim. So the first source that seems to discuss the idea of adding on a tefillah for Chanukah is the Tosefta. The Tosefta, in general, Tosefta is a group of texts that were written by the same authors of the Mishnah, of the Tanaim, but didn't make it into the set canon of the Mishnah for various reasons. And already there, they don't discuss the actual text, but there is a conversation regarding inserting something in our tefillah on Chanukah. Source number two. Says the Tosefta in Brachot, Kol she'ein bo musaf. Any day where we don't add a tefillah of musaf, kigon, Chanukah or Purim, like for example, Chanukah or Purim, Arvit, Shacharit, Umincha, Mitpalel, Shmona Esrei, Ve'omer, Me'ein HaMe'orah Behoda'ah. Then during the three tefillot, Arvit, Shacharit, and Mincha, during Shmona Esrei, we say a tefillah, Me'ein HaMe'orah. Me'ein HaMe'orah means something that is themed on the events that we're commemorating. So already here, and it says, where do we say them? We say them in the bracha of Hoda'ah. What's the bracha of Hoda'ah? Modim, exactly. And we noted last week that fits in with the theme of Al Hanisim and Chanukah in general being a time of Hoda'ah, that it's the only addition that we make. Al Hanisim is the only addition we make during specifically the bracha of Hoda'ah, of Modim, whereas Ya'aleh v'Yavo, which we often say on other Chagim, is actually mentioned in the earlier bracha of Ritzei, of Machazir Shechinato L'Tzion, and not in the bracha of Modim. So here we specifically have an initial idea that during the bracha of Hoda'ah, the bracha of Modim, we are supposed to insert something, include something connected to the time of year of Chanukah and Purim. And the truth is that the Gemara as well, the Gemara in Masechet Shabbat, also discusses the concept of adding something to the tefillah, and it has an interesting conversation regarding where we should include it. We know we're supposed to include it in tefillah, in Modim. What about Birkat HaMazon, as many of us are familiar with? We say Al Hanisim not just in Shemona Esrei, we also say it as part of Birkat HaMazon. Asks the Gemara in source number 3, Ibailahu. The Gemara asked, Mahu lahazkir shel Chanukah b'Birkat HaMazon. Should we mention the Chag of Chanukah and Birkat HaMazon as well? Says the Gemara, Kevan d'Rabbananu, since on the one hand it's only a rabbinic mitzvah, Right? It's not the idea of commemorating Hanukkah is certainly not biblical. How do we know that the mitzvah of Hanukkah, commemorating Hanukkah, is not biblical? Because the story happened after the Torah was given, right? Obviously, it is a dirabbanan, it is a rabbinic commandment. So on the one hand, maybe because it's rabbinic, we shouldn't mention it in Birkat HaMazon. Birkat HaMazon is actually a biblical text, or I mean, the idea of benching is biblical. O dilma mishum pirtshume nisa madkarinan. On the one hand, maybe because it's not oraisa, we shouldn't mention it. On the other hand, maybe because the whole point of it is lifarsem et hanes, to publicize the nes, maybe we should mention it in Birkat HaMazon as well. Amar Rava, Amar Rav Sichora. Dilma means perhaps. Yeah. Amar Rava, Amar Rav Sichora, Amar Rav Huna. Eino mazkir. So one opinion Rava says is you shouldn't mention it. V'im ba lahazkir. But if you do decide to mention it, meaning you don't have to, you're not obligated to, but if you want to, the proper place would be mazkir bahoda'ah. You should mention it in the bracha that is about things. Which bracha is about things? That's the nodeh, exactly, nodeh lecha. We thank you, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the bracha of, that ends with al haaretz v'al hamazon. That's where you should mention it. Rav Yehuda ikla lebei Rava. The Gemara tells us that one time Rav Huna, the son of Yehuda, was going to Rava. Savar la'adkurei b'bonei Yerushalayim. And he was going to mention it not in the bracha of Hoda'ah, the bracha of Nodeh. Rather, he wanted to mention it in the third bracha, which ends with Bonei Barachamav Yerushalayim. Amar lahu Rav Sheshes. Rav Sheshes, who was there at that time, was there. And he said, what do you mean? Kit tefillah. We should treat it just like tefillah. Ma tefillah b'hoda'ah. Af Birkat HaMazon b'hoda'ah. Just like when it comes to Shmona Esrei, which bracha do we mention al hanisim in? The bracha of Hoda'ah, the bracha of Modim. So too, what's the most appropriate place to put al hanisim in benching? The most appropriate place would be in Nodeh lecha, which is the bracha of Hoda'ah. So we see here again, the Gemara mentions this concept of mentioning al hanisim, mentioning something having to do with Chanukah, but the text itself has not yet been delineated. Sure.
Why was there ever a thought instead of al hanisim invention or instead just to add to Yalla B'Yovo Hanukkah or Purim instead of a separate one?
So that's a good question. That's a good question. I didn't see that. It doesn't mean it didn't take place. I didn't see that. I wonder if it had to do again with the delineation, meaning all the things that we mentioned in Yalla B'Yovo are fundamentally different. We're talking about the Chagim and all the biblical and Rosh Chodesh, which are different. So it could be that specifically the idea was to delineate between the two, between the chagim that are d'oraisa and the chagim that are d'Rabbanan. But I didn't see a discussion about that. But it's it's much longer. It's certainly much longer. It's certainly much longer. That's true. And I think I would think that the reason why they did it differently was, number one, because again to differentiate between the two, and perhaps, by the way, I don't know, but I wonder if part of the reason why it's longer is because it's rabbinic. Sometimes, interestingly enough, the Gemara will talk about how something which is rabbinic in nature, tzarich chizuk, it needs to be focused and stressed a little bit more. And it could be because there is no musaf, because there is no biblical connection to it. Therefore, they wanted to stress, the fact that, and especially Hanukkah. We talked. Someone suggested last week that the reason why Purim is a little bit shorter and Hanukkah is longer is because maybe Purim has the Megillah, whereas Hanukkah we don't have. I mean, there is a text from Maccabim, but it's not canonized and it's not part of our conversation. So it could be that's why we're more it's more verbose. Although part of what we spoke about last week also was perhaps the reason why it's more verbose is because it highlights the idea of thanking. That when you thank somebody, you should be as verbose as possible. Thank you for this and thank you for that. And perhaps it's teaching us lessons on Hoda'ah. Yes. Excellent question. Yes, practically, we say that if you forgot it in either Shmona Esrei or in Birkat HaMazon, you do not have to repeat it. If you didn't finish the bracha that you were up to, meaning if, let's say, you remembered before you said the bracha that was following it, you should go back. But once you finish the bracha, then you do not have to go back. Again, this isn't our issue, so I'll mention it briefly. There is a way to opportunity that if you forget it and you still haven't finished Shmona Esrei or Birkat HaMazon, you can insert it towards the end. For example, in Shmona Esrei, if you forgot it, you can, before you take 3 steps back during the Yehu L'Ratzon, you can add al hanisim there. And the same thing with Birkat HaMazon. There is an opportunity where at the part towards the end of benching, where there's the harachaman, where we add the harachaman for Shabbat and for Chag, you can add al hanisim there as well, as a way if you forgot. But once you've finished benching or you finish Shmona Esrei, then you do not have to repeat it. Okay, so now where do we see the text or at least indications of discussions of the text. So one of the earlier sources, in source number 4, is Masechet Sofrim. Masechet Sofrim is one of the smaller tractates that, again, is connected to. It's not officially canonized in Shisha Sidrei Mishnah in the Shas as we know it, but at the same time it is brought down, especially in most of our copies of the Gemara, because it was written along the same time. But at the same time, it wasn't officially part of the. It wasn't written at the same time as the Mishnah, but as the Gemara. It's more in the 8th century, and it is considered to be an authoritative source, although many aspects of its authorship are not 100% clear. So in Masechet Sofrim, we have a conversation regarding the text of Al-Hanisim. Source number 4. Ve'omrim behodaya. In the bracha of Hodaya, we say, V'hodaot plaot u'tshuat kohanim. We say to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, we thank him for the wonders and the savior of the Kohanim, Asher Asita bimei Matityahu ben Yochanan Kohen Gadol Chashmona Yuvanav. For all that you did for Matityahu and his children. So, as you can see, the text is different, but there's clear echoes of the text that we have, where it talks about the focus on Matityahu and his family, Chashmona Yuvanav, and then he adds, V'chein Aseh imanu Hashem Elokeinu v'Elokei Avosenu Nisim v'niflaot v'nodeh l'shimcha lanetzach. And then, this is an important piece, included in the text is not just a thank you to HaKadosh Baruch Hu for the past, but it then ends with, Chen aseh imanu. You should also continue to do HaKadosh Baruch Hu to us. Nisim v'niflaos, as we continue going. Baruch atah Hashem, that's the Baruch, the Bet Aleph Yud, Hatov Nisim, and then Mordechai ve'Esther maskirotam ve'hodaya v'shnehem niskarim b'birkat hamazon. So what was interesting about this text is not just the fact that we have echoes of our text, but that there's something fundamentally different. Our text of Al-Hanisim is all about what has been done to us. We saw last week that it's not just thinking the historical thinking, but it's also thinking the things that HaKadosh Baruch Hu has done for us in the past. But it does not include a tefillah for the future. And yet here, this text of the initial text of Al-Hanisim includes both a thank you for the past and a tefillah that Kadosh Baruch Hu should continue to do this for us in the future. And this became a fascinating debate amongst many of the Rishonim regarding whether or not in Al-Hanisim should we only be focusing on thanking Hashem for what he has done for us, or should we also be inserting a tefillah that just like you did that for us in the past, or you've done it for us even today, you should continue to do that for us moving forward. If you look at source number 5, source number 5, we'll skip source number 5 for now. We'll go to the Seder, source number 6, the Siddur of Rav Amram Gaon. This is one of the earliest copy of a text of a Siddur that we're aware of. It was authored by one of the Gaonim, Rav Amram Gaon, and he basically goes through the entire, an initial copy of the text as we know it of the Siddur, and he mentions Al-Hanisim as well. And what does he say in source number 6? Bimei Matityahu ben Yochanan Kohen Gadol Chashmona Yuvanav, because he quotes, I didn't bring it for you, but he basically quotes our text of Al-Hanisim mostly. V'kavu shmonat yamim b'hallel u'voda'a l'shimcha. And it should include also, and you established 8 days of Hallel u'voda'a, and then it ends, the same thing we saw before. U'kishem she'asita imahem nes, just like you did a nes for them. Kain aseh imanu Hashem Elokeinu nisim v'niflaot be'et hazot v'nodeh l'shimcha gadol sela. Just like you did miracles for them, so too you should continue, or you should do miracles for us, and we will continue to thank you. Amen. Sela. Just 1 second. I'll take a question or comment. Not everyone agrees to this. If you look at the Sefer Hamanhig, source number 7, and he's representative of many of the other Geonim and Rishonim, he disagrees with including this in our tefillah. Ha'omer basof kishem she'asita imahem nes kain asa imanu Hashem Elokeinu lo yitachen. He says it's not appropriate. It's not appropriate for us to be adding at the end of a tefillah of thanks to then be adding a tefillah that's then to be asking for more. When you thank, and when you ask for more, you ask for more, and they should be separated. The hoda'ahi, says the Sefer HaMali, because this is meant to be a thanks. V'lo bakasha. This isn't meant to be a tefillah that's about request. V'ra'iti b'mei chorfi b'lonil ha'ir ha'kedosha shehayu mon'in et ha'chazan mile'omer. And I saw when I was younger in the town of Lonil, the holy town of Lonil, which was in Europe, one of the earlier towns of the Rishonim, Shayumon, they would stop the chazan, which means, again, the language that he's using almost implies that there was maybe a bit of a disagreement in the community whether or not to include this or not. And that in this community, the minhag was the chazan was not allowed to add that extra line of, just like you've done it in the past, so too you should do it for us in the future. Yes? Good. Okay, so correct. So what you're suggesting is that perhaps this is about that we saw last week that one of the texts that we have for the tefillah is that we say so that's the standard text, which means that you did it for us in those days at this time. Some have the Lavush is the famously has it says that it's Vayamim Ahem Ubazman Hazeh, which means we're thanking HaKadosh Baruch Hu not just for what he did then, but also for what he does for us now. Now, although I'm not sure I agree with you 100%, because there we're still exactly. There, the question is, we're still focusing on thank you for what you've done. The question is, are you only focusing on the past back in the times, or are we also thanking for what's happening now? And here, their suggestion is we should go even further and use this as an opportunity to ask for more. And I think that, yes, sure.
So in the modim tefillah itself, in the modim that we say in the Shtulah Shmona Esrei, we don't say, but in the modim the Rabbanan, we say.
Interesting. A very good point. That's a good point. Where in the regular text of modim, we generally focus on the past, but in the modim de Rabbanan, which is the text that we say when we have the Chazarat Hashatz, when the Chazan goes over the Shmona Esrei again, then we do have that piece of it. It's an interesting point. Now, how do we paskin? How do we paskin with this? So look at the Shulchan Aruch. The Shulchan Aruch in source number 8 mentions this whole discussion, and he says the following: Ein omrim kishem she'asita v'chulei. You should not, we paskin that you don't add in this final text of just like you did things for Am Yisrael in the past, so too you should continue to do it for us in the future. That you shouldn't do. Ela misayim. You should finish with the following text: V'asita imahem nisim ugvorot b'yamim ahem ba'et hazot. Okay, so basically he says you should end with talking about what had been done, even if it means including nowadays, but it means what has been done and not necessarily asking for the future. V'yesh omrim shomrim oto, and some say you should. Okay, now generally when the Shulchan Aruch mentions both, and he just mentions one and they mention Yoshomrim, the Shulchan Aruch usually means to follow. The assumption is he means to follow the first opinion that he had mentioned and not the Yesh Omrim, and in fact that is our minhag. Our minhag, that most texts of Al-Nisim do not include a tefillah moving forward. There are some texts, interestingly enough, I don't remember, I think in Italian text, there are some communities that still do add this line, but the standard texts generally do not. Says the Mishnah Berurah, what's the reason not to? Why not include a request moving forward? So there's two potential reasons not to. Yesh Omrim, we're in source number 8 in the Mishnah Berurah, the second paragraph. Some people say, why shouldn't you add this extra line? Mishum delo yish'al adam tzrachav begimel rishonot ve'achronot. Some people say that if you know, as many people might be familiar with, there's a certain text, there's a certain rhythm and design to Shmona Esrei. The first 3 brachot are meant to be what we call shevach, we praise HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The middle part of Shmona Esrei is meant to be where we make our requests, and the end is supposed to be hoda'ah. So says the Mishnah Berurah, some people have a problem with adding in this line because we've now entered the last 3 brachot, and during those 3 brachot, you shouldn't be making personal requests. You shouldn't be asking for things. You should only be thanking. Says the Mishnah Berurah, that is what some people say, but he says, I disagree with that. That wouldn't be the reason not to do it. Why not? But that's a mistaken explanation. Shari. Because he says the truth is that when we talk about not having requests in the last 3 brachot, that means personal requests. But communal requests, community requests for the tzibor, that should be allowed. So then what's the reason for those who say we shouldn't do it? Ela ikar hata'am. Rather, he says the main reason is something else. Debekol davar dahave lehaba, tiknu belehaba, uvidvar dehoda'a, have leshe'avar. He says basically the main reason is because it's important to distinguish what and focus on what you're focusing on. There are certain times where you should be focusing on asking for the future, and the focus should be on the future. And there should be moments where you're focusing simply on thanking on the past, and you shouldn't be jumping to add on something else at the end. The Ikar al-Anisim have l'kishe'avar, and the Ikar al-Anisim is a focus on the past. So how do we understand this? Why do you think it's important that we should differentiate or distinguish between when we're focusing on the past or focus. What's wrong with both? What's wrong with thank you for what you've done and please continue to do that?
It's a little bit of being like, I don't want to say piggish, but it's, thank you for what you've done. Thank you for inviting me for Shabbos, and I hope I get 10 more.
Yeah, I think I agree. I think that again, there are moments where it might be appropriate, but as a general, it reminds me, it's a different example, but I think it's a similar idea. Very often they say that if you ever want to, if you ever want to give somebody feedback, you should never be like, you were great, but, right? Meaning you should know when there's moments when you should be saying this, you did great, and let that great or let that positive feedback sit there. The second you open with you did this and this right, but you did this and this wrong, what happens? You lose the first part of the sentence. It's almost as if you diluted it by switching from one to the next. And it's more appropriate for you to focus on if there's the time when you need to give positive feedback or positive reinforcement or criticism, whatever you want to call it, do that appropriately. When you mix the two together, then you almost dilute both. So I think in the similar idea, that's perhaps what we're saying here. It's one thing that when you have to ask for requests, there's a time for requests. There's an appropriate time for request, and it should be done. But there's also an appropriate time where your focus should simply be on thank you. Thank you for all you've done, maybe even thank you for what you've done in the past and what you do for me now. The focus should all be on that, and it shouldn't be on also trying to stick in, and by the way, please continue to do that, even though obviously there's a time for that as well. Yes?
Another way of looking at that.
Please.
That it's not an insult to somebody to ask more, but that rather it's a compliment to Hashem. That in other words, you've done such wonderful things for us. Yeah. We'd love to count on you
To continue to do that. Yafe?
That's a compliment.
So I think I agree with you. I think that there's no way to look at it, and I think that is 100% perhaps how we could understand the opinion that says we should add it. Meaning, I think the opinion that's saying we should add it isn't saying, we don't care about, I think there's different approaches to it. I think there's different approaches to how to do this, and it could also be that there's different moments when one is appropriate and one is not appropriate. I agree with you. I think that there's definitely different ways to look at it, and I think that is exactly the debate here. That is exactly the debate. In the end, we poskin that we should focus simply on what has been done. That doesn't mean there's never a time for both. There's never a time for focusing on the future. But I think that's a good point.
Like when your wife bakes a wonderful cake and says it's delicious. I'm looking forward to the next one.
How would you feel about that? Wives, how would you feel about that? Okay, so I think a wife could take that. Some would love that, and some would say, just be happy with what you got, right? I think we could see that in both directions, and I think I think everybody has to know, what's right and what's appropriate. So yeah, but anyway, I thought this was a fascinating debate and an important conversation that I only uncovered as a result of some of your questions. So I thank you for that, because again, what we've seen here is this important debate, and we see it being carried out in the discussion regarding the actual text and liturgy itself about how a person is meant to think. What is the appropriate way to think? What is perhaps maybe the not appropriate way to think? What is considered okay? And that itself you see being played out in the different conversations.
This year, is it appropriate to also add, may we see more miracles?
So you're saying maybe this year where Am Yisrael specifically needs that, is it appropriate to add it? I think it's certainly appropriate to add it in general. I think it's important to stick with the liturgy of what's considered the appropriate text of what we have. But I think obviously we do, for example, we add many of us add Tehillim to our tefillah. In my community, they still say Avinu Malkeinu after Shemona Esrei every Shacharit and Mincha. So I definitely agree that the idea of adding on extra tefillot should be done. I don't necessarily think that we should change what's considered to be the text as we have it. But I think also a person can add it on their own. There's no reason why after, at the end of Shemona Esrei, you can have special tefillot where you continue to daven. I think we all should be davening for that and asking. I think it's okay to ask. But I don't necessarily think that we should necessarily be changing the text itself. But at least it's important to see how even within the text itself, there was a struggle to find that right balance. That's a great question. Okay, the other piece that I wanted to mention, which we did discuss a little bit last week as well. I shared the idea with you, but I actually found a little bit more on this, is regarding the language in the beginning of Al-Hanisim, where we say, and as we mentioned last week, this is very connected to current events as well. We say in Al-Hanisim v'al porkon v'al gvurot v'al tshuot v'al hamilchamot. So one of the questions we raised last week was, why are we thanking Hashem for the war? Right? We're thanking God for a war. We're experiencing war right now, and we see the horrors of war. We see the pain of war. We see what war does to a people and to a society. And so why are we thanking Hashem for, and if some people want to suggest maybe it's we're thanking Hashem for saving us during the war, but that's the purkan. That's the part that we say before, that we say the alat shuot, all the salvation. What are we referring to? The salvation from war. So the question is, why are we including war in this conversation? So in fact, after doing a little bit of research, there are actually a number of texts that don't include it. If you look at source number 9, I brought you the Svardim, meaning Edut Mizrach. Edut Mizrach does not include milchamot. Their version is al ha-purkan, v'al ha-gvurot, v'al ha-tshuot, v'al ha-niflaot, v'al ha-nechamot. Okay, so they don't even have the text milchamot. I don't know why, but it could be that it's connected to our question. Nusach Sfarad, meaning not Edut Mizrach, not Sfardi, but more Nusach Sfarad, has both. They have al ha-nechamot, but they also have al ha-milchamot. And after doing a little bit of research, there's a number of different texts that I could have brought for you here. So some of them don't. Some of them don't have totally different texts. But it's interesting to see, and I wonder if part of the reason why they don't include al milchamot is because of this question. But then we have to answer the question: why do we Ashkenazim include al milchamot? So what I mentioned to you last week, and I shared it with you, and I brought it for you this week in the text itself, in source number 10, is a suggestion that is made by Rav Yaakov Ariel. Rav Yaakov Ariel is the Rav of Ramat Gan, and I think this is an idea that I've heard has been echoed in a number of different places, where he highlights that the concept that as much as milchamot are painful, and as much as milchamot are something we never ask for, we always continue to daven for the time, as we say, when we can fulfill the Navi, we look forward and we continue to daven that we should be zochet to see a time when everybody puts down their weapons and there is no war. That is what we strive for and daven for and hope for. At the same time, there is something powerful that occurs to a nation during times of war, and there's a certain movement as a nation and a growth that a person goes through, or that the nation goes through, as a result of war. And that, again, lahavdil, but a similar type of approach to it would be when a person, chas v'shalom, has to deal with a certain illness. Now, obviously, a person would never want that illness to have ever occurred. But sometimes, when a person looks back after the illness, they're able to see certain aspects of growth that they were able to achieve within themselves as a result of that challenge. And there's almost a certain level of thanks to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Again, everybody is different and every situation is different, but an ability for us to look at some of those challenges and still see growth and still see aspects of who we are that have been shown through that war. So look at source number 10. I'll read it with you inside. Ulam, says Rav Ariel, Ma yesh lehodot al hamilchamot shemutav lahen shelo hayu ba'olam. Why are we thanking HaKadosh Baruch Hu for wars that we wish never occurred? We wish we didn't have to go to war. Al korchenu aleinu lomar. We must say, she'umnam she'ifatenu hi. Our ambition is lehitkadshmut hachazon hashalom hanisgav shel haneviim. We continue to dream and have an ambition for the realization of the vision of having peace and no longer having war. Shelo yisagoy el goy cherev v'lo yimadu on milchama. That nations will not raise a sword to each other and there will no longer be war. Excuse me. Ulam ka'asher hakadosh baruch hu mizamein lanu milchamot. When wars do occur, when HaKadosh Baruch Hu does bring about a certain reality where wars do occur, gam yesh bahem yesh matana min hashamayim. There is a certain aspect of gift. Now listen to the way he describes it. Matana zu gnuzahi ve'atufa veheres uvehereg. The gift itself is wrapped in destruction and death. Bitsa'ar ve'ke'ev, in pain and in tremendous hurt. V'gam ota aleinu lekabel bi'ava. And we have to, and I'm not saying it's easy, try to accept that with love. And therefore there is an aspect, says Rav Ariel, of growth that we as a nation achieve, and sometimes even as people achieve, through pain and through horrific things that happen to us in our lives, including war. And therefore, even for milchamot, there's an aspect of thanks that we give to HaKadosh Baruch Hu for that war. HaMilchama, just to see the next line, HaMilchama choreget miseder hachayim haragil. Milchama causes us to step out of our normal day-to-day lives. Ume'aletzet otanu, and it pushes us, latzet min hatoda'ah harigila shel zmanei harigia. It forces us out of our day-to-day schedules and our day-to-day routines that we usually have during times of calmness. Hamilchama yotzeret toda'a acheret. War creates a new reality, a new world, which I'm sure all of us understand. The reality that we have today, a year after October 7th, is a fundamentally different world than we had before in many different ways. Shechelek mimena miyuchad limei milchama atzmam, and some aspects of that reality are connected to the actual war. V'chelek mimena makrin gam al hayamim she'achareh, and some of them continue to be in existence even and continue to shine and continue to be shown even after the war ends. And so this year, when we say Al Hanisim V'Al HaPurkan, and we say Al HaMilchamot, it's incumbent upon us to sit with this. It's not easy, right? A person's going through, because we're still going through the war. A person's going through a horrific event in their personal lives. To thank Hashem for that is very, very challenging. Sometimes, in retrospect, they're able to. But for us, we should be sitting with this issue. We should be saying, what does it mean, Al HaMilchamot? So here, Rav Ariel, and this is based off of many of the writings of Rav Kook. Rav Kook writes that from a national perspective, war brings the country and the nation to new places and brings us, as in his view, toward closer and closer to the Geula Shlema, which we daven, we're moving closer to. But it's important to understand that from a certain perspective, this is what is happening here, and hopefully we're able to tap into that. A certain sense of appreciation and recognition that we wish we didn't have to go through it, but that there are certain things that we have seen within the country and within ourselves that have occurred as a result of this war, and that's what we're thanking HaKadosh Baruch Hu for on Al Hanisim. I saw a couple of questions. Yes?
Yeah, no, I was just going to comment on that because we do see there's a resurgence in some sort of a spiritual recognition of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. I think there's more of a view of the Nisim that are happening, and these only happen and it's happened in this country time and again during wartime.
Correct. So that's an example. I think each person will see the different aspects. I think what you're highlighting is 100% true. The challenge becomes how to keep that going, and hopefully not have to have that during times of war, or to keep it going. Did you have a question?
Yeah, just also a comment that we also say Cholayim Ra'im, and we would think that every Choly is Ra. But obviously,
right. That's the fact that there's a Chalayim Ra'im means that there are Chalayim that maybe are meant to be. We don't understand that 100%. Yes.
I think that it's necessary to read Al HaMilchamot, that you're thanking God for the wars. But basically, I think it's a shorthand for saying how we survive these wars and how we emerge in a positive way.
Right. So again, I think
God for war.
Again, I think the challenge. So I think what you're saying is similar to what we're saying. It's just a way of phrasing it. First of all, to thank God for saving us from the wars. I think the challenge is that we say that earlier when we say Al HaTshuot and Al HaPurkan. That means God saved us. So therefore, But again, I think again, when we say we're thanking Hashem for the wars, we're not saying we're happy that we have the wars. We're saying we wish we didn't have the wars, but we're thankful for whatever aspects of who we are and the nation is that we survived. But I even think that many people will suggest that we're in a different place. Again, I don't want to get tricky, and I don't want to get sensitive, because obviously, and again, my point here is I think we should sit with this. I don't think I'm bringing you this suggestion, and if it's meaningful for you, great. And if it's not, then I think we need to think about this. I think even if it's meaningful for us, we need to sit with this. As we're sitting there on Hanukkah this year, and we're saying Al HaMilchamot in Al Hanisim, and we're saying it also when we light the Hanukkah candles. What does it mean? What does it mean, Al HaMilchamot? And I'm bringing you the suggestion here. And if it sits with you and you can relate to it, great. And if not, then I think it's something that we all should be thinking about, and really bringing it home this year. And I think it's a fair point. And again, I think everybody will relate to it differently. One other suggestion, one other major thing that I wanted to highlight within Al Hanisim before we get to Hanirot Halalu is something that I read in the book of Rav Soloveitchik called Days of Deliverance, where he has a number of essays on Purim and Hanukkah. And he notes a very interesting distinction within the text of Al Hanisim between the one on Hanukkah and the text that we say for Purim, aside from obviously how verbose it is. He points out that if you look at the text itself, and this I thought was very interesting. If we turn now for 1 second, go back to source number 1, where I brought you the text of the Al Hanisim for Purim. So Rav Soloveitchik points out that if you look through the text of Al Hanisim for Purim, there is zero mention of human involvement in the Nes. It's all what HaKadosh Baruch Hu does for Am Yisrael. We'll read through it quickly. It does mention Mordechai ve'Esther, but it doesn't mention Mordechai ve'Esther in terms of the actions. It mentions Mordechai ve'Esther to talk about What time we're talking about? Bimei Mordechai ve'Esther b'Shushana Abira, during the time of Mordechai ve'Esther, Kishamar aleim Haman HaRasha, when Haman HaRasha stood up to destroy them, Bikesh lashmid laharog u'la'abed, he wanted to destroy them. Et kol ha'Yehudim minar va'ad zakein, from small to older, Taf v'nashim b'yom echad, women and children, on one day, Shlosha Asar l'chodesh Shnei Masar, the 13th of the 12th month, Hu Chodesh Adar. Ve'ata b'rachamecha harabim, and you in your mercy, Hefarta et atzato, you destroyed their plan. Kilkalta et machshavto, you got rid of what they were planning to do. Vashevoto lo gmulo barosho, and you gave them mida keneged mida and hung them on the vitaluoto of et banav al ha'etz. No mention at all of human involvement. Now, if you take a look at the al hanisim of Chanukah, there's definitely a big focus of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, but there's also a conversation. Even when we say Rabim biyad ma'atim tzmeim biyad torim, what are we mentioning? That we still did something. And not only that, it says also towards the end, it says, where it discusses how Am Yisrael pinu et va'achar kach ba'u v'necha, the second to last line of Al Anisim here, ba'u v'necha l'dvir beisecha, finu es heichalecha, they cleared out the heichal, tiharu et mikdashecha, we purified the mikdash, v'hidliku neirot, and they lit the candles. There's much more of a conversation of human involvement in Al Anisim of Chanukah than there is on Purim. And Rav Soloveitchik wants to understand why that is. So if you look now, just for time purposes, I want to make sure that we cover everything. Look at source number 11. Beautiful idea. If you are to compare the Al Hanisim that we recite on Purim with the Al Hanisim that we recite on Chanukah, you will find an important distinction. In the Al Hanisim of Purim, there is nothing mentioned of Mordechai and Esther's role in the unfolding of the dramatic events about which the Megillah tells us. We know from the Megillah that Mordechai took initiative, meaning that there's anyone who looks through the Purim story knows that Mordechai took initiative and Esther went to Achashverosh. Esther was ready to sacrifice herself. But in Al Hanisim, the names of Mordechai and Esther are only mentioned as an indication of the period during which these events transpired. Though the Megillah depicts the human role and human action, they are completely ignored in the Al Hanisim. The Megillah mentions them, but Al Hanisim does not mention them at all. However, the Al Hanisim does not shy away from mentioning human action by us. We're talking now about of Chanukah. Now, sorry, we skipped a little bit, but in Chanukah, the Al Hanisim of Chanukah does not shy away from mentioning human action. Of course, God made it possible. Meaning, everyone knows that in Chanukah it was a Kadosh Baruch Hu. But he gave them the strength to fight, he helped them defeat the enemy, and emerged triumphant from the engagement. Yet there is a human participation in the Al Hanisim of Chanukah. The role of the Chashmonaim has been emphasized, while there is not a single word about the role of which Esther and Mordechai played when it comes to Purim. Even when we recite Hanirot Halalu, we speak of the miracle and wonders that you perform for our forefathers by means al yedei kohanecha kadoshim. We talk about the Kohanim as being involved in the miracle. However, on Purim, when we recite the bracha, the bracha after the Megillah, we say Harav et rivenu, v'adan et dinenu, v'hanakom et nikmatenu. That's the bracha we say after the Megillah. We talk about how Hashem acts vengeance, takes out vengeance, took care of us, and punishes everybody. Again, the focus is more on God and less on human involvement. And the question is why? Second to last paragraph in source number 11. We learn from this that when the fight is spiritual, God invites the Jew to participate. When spiritual survival is at stake, man must take the initiative. Even though man is under the guidance of the Almighty, man takes the initiative and therefore his role is recorded. However, when it is only a question of physical survival, God acts differently. And I should note, by the way, that in this same essay, Rav Soloveitchik compares Purim to Pesach. It says if you look in the Haggadah on Pesach, there's no mention. There's only one mention of who's missing from the entire Haggadah. Moshe. He's mentioned once when they're talking about different aspects. Very agav. So says Soloveitchik is the same idea. The focus is not on what the Jews did to help get them out of Mitzrayim. The focus is only on HaKadosh Baruch Hu, because again, there as well, it was about the physical survival of the Jewish people. When there's a physical menace or the threat of physical destruction, God uses the human hand as an instrument of his will. He recruits man. He uses human energy, human resources to implement the plan that he has devised. But Judaism has said that in this case, the man who is the messenger of God should not be credited with the salvation. Spiritual achievements are attributed to man. Military achievements are attributed to God. And so this is a beautiful distinction that Rav Soloveitchik suggests regarding why there's less of a focus in Al Hanisim of Chanukah there's more of a focus on human involvement, whereas in Purim there's less of a focus on the human involvement, because on Purim there was the concern for physical destruction, and therefore God's hand is clearer, and that's where the focus is made, even though there certainly was human involvement, and that was necessary. Whereas on Hanukkah, when we're talking about the spiritual destruction, there God waited more for our initiative in order to create that, and that's why the focus is more on man. Okay, yes, I'll take a few questions. Yes. Is on yes, that's one of the going up. Some suggest that, although maybe that means that you shouldn't spin the dreidel upside down. But yes, correct. That the focus is on some kids like to do that. But yes, that's some have connected the grogger to the dreidel, that the dreidel is focusing from up above to focus downward as opposed to the grogger which is above. Yes, that's very nice. Yes, did you want to make a comment? Oh. Absolutely. Absolutely. There's no question that is true. But sometimes there's also a value in focus on one more than the other, just to make points. True. 100%. Yes. Yafeh. The balance is very different. The balance is very interesting. Yafeh. I hadn't thought of that. Yeah, that's also true. There might be an interesting balance between that. That's very interesting. Very interesting. Although it's interesting, it's a good point. It's a good point. And in fact, we have that same balance regarding Hanukkah in the sense that in Al-Hanisim, we only mention, or the focus is on the miracle of the victory, whereas in the Gemara, which is the other main text, the only mention is on the candles. So yes, I think what it's doing is highlighting different things, and that's a very, very, very good point. Okay, the other text that I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about was the text of Hanirot Halalu. Hanirot Halalu is a text that we say after lighting candles. Again, the source of this text is not 100% clear, but it seems to be recorded already in very, very early sources. Even I didn't bring it for you here, but even in the Siddur of Rav Amram Gaon, there is a text of Hanirot Halalu that is recorded. I brought for you here our text. And I want to just read through it, and we'll see some of the very similar themes to what we say in Al-Hanisim, but yet there's one interesting point that's highlighted here that I think is interesting, that is worth noting. So this is the text that we say. We'll just go through it and translate it. Hanerot halalu she'anu madlikim, these candles that we light. Why are we lighting them? Al hanisim v'al haniflaot, because of the miracles and the niflaot and the wonders, v'al hatishuot v'al hamilchamot, and the salvation and the wars. She'asita la'avosenu b'yamim hahem b'zman hazeh, that you did for our forefathers in those days, at this time. Al yedei kohanecha kadoshim, and again you carry them out through our kohanim. V'kol shmonat yimei Chanukah hanerot halalu kodeshem, and throughout all 8 days of Chanukah, these candles are holy. And we are not allowed to use them. We'll get to that in a second. We're only allowed to look at them. In order to thank you and to praise you. For your miracles, for your wonders, and for your salvation. So we see in the beginning many themes that we saw is very similar to Al-Hanisim. But what's the one theme that's highlighted here that isn't in Al-Hanisim? Or what's one aspect that seems, at least to me, when I first read this, a little bit interesting that we're highlighting it? We're not allowed to use the candles. That is true. Absolutely. We're not allowed to use the candles, but there are many halachot about lighting candles that we don't mention. Meaning, there's one of the halachot of the candles is you're not allowed to use the candles. That is 100% correct. We're not allowed to benefit from the candles. Interestingly, we contrast that to what other candles that we light? Shabbos candles, not only are we allowed to benefit, but we're supposed to benefit from the Shabbos candles. That's why we light the Shabbos candles. Hanukkah candles we're not allowed to benefit from. My question is, that is true, but there's also halacha of when to light the candles. There's a halacha of where to light the candles. We don't talk about that in Hanirot Halalu, meaning why is there this focus on that we're not allowed to use them? And by the way, interestingly enough, but that's my question. What does that mean? How does the fact that we don't use the candles Kedei lehodot ulehalel. Meaning, what is it about the fact that we don't use the candles that makes it almost more of a thanks to HaKadosh Baruch Hu? That's the question. So look at the source for this idea. The source for the idea that we're not allowed to use the candles is a Gemara in Masechet Shabbat. I'm just taking a quick look at the time. Okay, we have some time. The Gemara, and this is actually a debate. There is a machloket in the Gemara whether or not the candles on the Hanukkah should or are allowed to be benefited from. I'm just going to bring you the opinion that says that not, because that's how we paskin. Amar Rabbi Zera, Amar Rav Masne. Rabbi Zera says in the name of Rav Masne, Ve'amri la, Amar Rav Zera, Amar Rav, and some people say it's Rav Zera in the name of Rav. psilot ushmanim she'amru chachamim ein madlikim bahem b'Shabbat, madlikim bahem b'Chanukah. Even though when it comes to the candles of Shabbat, there are certain oils and certain wicks that you should not use. And the reason why you shouldn't use those wicks and oils is because they're not considered to be quality oils and wicks. So even though there are certain oils and wicks you can't use on Shabbos, those same oils and wicks, says the Gemara, you are allowed to use them for Chanukah. You're allowed to use them for Chanukah. Bein b'chol, bein b'Shabbos, both during the week and on Shabbos. Amar Rabbi Yirmiyah, my time. But what's the reason? Why differentiate between Shabbos and Chanukah? So he says, the kasavar kavta ein zakukla ve'asur lehishtamesh lora. We're going to leave the first part of that sentence to the side for now. But one of the reasons that he says that you can use any oil and wicks that you want to is because you're not allowed to benefit from them. What's the reason they say you should use specific oils and wicks on Shabbos? Is because since the oils and wicks are meant to be used and benefited from, we only want you to use wicks and oils that are quality. Because we're afraid that if they're not quality and you start to use them because you want to read on Shabbos, let's say next to the candle, and it starts to go out or it starts not, what are you going to do? You might move the oil, you might do something in order to fix the wick. And therefore the Chazal say you should only use quality oil and quality wicks. But says the Gemara here, but Hanukkah candles, we can't use them anyway. And since we can't use them anyway, as long as they're going to last the amount of time that you need, that's good enough. Okay, so we see that there is this halacha, this concept that ein lanu reshut lehishtamesh, we're not allowed to use them for reading, we're not allowed to use them for light. That's why, as many of you are familiar with, that's why what do we add to each of our Chanukiot? The shamash. The purpose of the shamash, the extra candle that we light, many people think it's because we're using it in order to light the rest of our candles. You can use it to light the rest of your candles, you don't have to. But the main purpose of the shamash, which sits separately from the other candles, is so that in case by accident you use the Chanukiah to read, you can always say, I wasn't using the Chanukiah candles, I was using the shamash. That's the reason we have the shamash, and that's the reason why the shamash sits separately, to show that it's not part of the regular count. But the question is, why is this so important? Meaning, what do we get from this? So look at Rashi. Rashi here says something very interesting. The asur lehishtamesh leora. Why? And you can't use them. Sheyehe nikar shehu ner mitzvah. By making this a candle that you can't benefit, you're announcing to everybody that what's the only reason you're lighting these candles? For the mitzvah, or as we would say it, for the Persumei Nisa. Okay. The point is that you can't use them for anything else. And therefore, there's a certain inherent value in that when we say, what we're saying is, the fact that I don't use them shows the only reason I lit these candles is because I want to use them as an opportunity to publicize the nes. I want to use these candles as an opportunity to show the world the miracle of Hanukkah, which means, by the way, that we are using them on a certain level. Okay? You're allowed to use them to see them. You're allowed to use them to enjoy the light, meaning to enjoy looking at the light. You're just not allowed to, what we would say, benefit from them. And therefore, that's an important distinction. But I think that there are other lessons that we can learn from this. There are other lessons from this halakha. It's not just a halakha. And the question is obviously trying to highlight, but wait a second, there's another mitzvah that we have, a ner shel Shabbat. There's another mitzvah that we do, another candle that we do as a mitzvah. And we also benefit from it. I mean, why not say the same thing about Shabbos? We shouldn't use the Shabbos candles because that way we show we're doing it for the mitzvah. And the answer is because the Shabbos candles are fundamentally different. The purpose of the Shabbos candles is to make sure that we have a lit up house on Shabbat. The purpose of the Hanukkah candles is clearly something else. Persumei Nisa, but perhaps it's more. Look at source number 14. Rabbi Abraham J. Twersky in his book, I forgot to mention the book. I wrote it, Twersky on Prayer. So he has a beautiful idea where he tries to suggest a couple of other ideas that we can gain from this idea of ein lanu reshut lehishtamesh bahem. He says the following in source number 14. Most military triumphs are for personal gain, for expansion of the country's boundaries, and for booty. The victory of Hanukkah was to permit the Jews to restore the service in the Temple of Jerusalem and to allow them to observe all the mitzvot of the Torah. Our goal in the fighting Hanukkah wasn't to get more land. It wasn't to be able to conquer more. It was simply to enable us to do what we want to do, which is to serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu and get back to doing that. No personal gain was sought. Hence, we may not use the illumination of the Hanukkah candles for personal needs. So he suggests perhaps part of the idea of why we can't use the candles is to highlight that the purpose of this war, of why we fought this war, was simply a national concept. We wanted to be able to serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu and be the Jewish nation that we were before the Greeks came in and destroyed. Hanukkah underscores the mission of Judaism to bring the light of the true God to the world. But then he says there may be an additional message. The Syrian Greeks sought to impose Hellenism on Israel. The philosophy of Torah and Hellenism are at opposite poles. Hellenism is hedonistic. It teaches that a person should seek to maximize his pleasure, for this earthly world is the only world, and one should derive as much pleasure as possible during one's lifetime. Torah teaches us that man was placed in this earthly world to fulfill a mission dictated by God. The ultimate existence is in the eternal world, but in order to merit being in the imminent presence of God in the eternal world, man must fulfill the mitzvos of the Torah. Man may certainly enjoy the earthly world, but his enjoyment must be within the parameters prescribed by the Torah, and he must give praise to God for the pleasures he experiences. In sharp contrast to Hellenism, Torah teaches that pleasure is not the goal of life. To emphasize the Torah principle, the lights of Hanukkah, which represent the triumph of Torah over Hellenism, are sacred. They're kadosh. In contradistinction to the Sabbath candles, one should not derive any benefit from the Hanukkah lights. They are to be observed but not used. It is a symbolic expression that the goods of this world are not here primarily for our pleasure. We may indeed partake of them, but only because they are a vehicle for achieving a spiritual goal. So here you have this beautiful distinction that he suggests, or that Rabbi Twersky suggests, how this is a lesson for us in general of one of the messages of Judaism, which is that we're not here in this world just to gain benefit from everything around us. And that there are certain things in this world where we should step back and dafka not benefit from them and not use them to our benefit in order to show and teach us this overall lesson, which is the opposite of what Hellenism, what the Greeks believed in Hellenism. But there's one other idea that I want to share with you, and with this we'll end. And this is the distinction Rav Soloveitchik makes between the two different types of candles. And he points out that there are two different types of candles and lights that are in the world. There are some lights that are meant to be used in general, that are meant to be benefited from, and then there are certain lights that we have in the world, certain candles or lights we have in the world, that we can't actually benefit from them, but they're more like we would call guides. And the best example he brings is stars. Stars are a light that we can't actually benefit from, but yet at the same time, they point us in the right direction. And that, he suggests, perhaps is the goal of the lights of Hanukkah. Source number 15. In this regard, it is instructive to compare the Hanukkah candles to the Sabbath candles. It is permissible, in fact desirable, to make sure of the Ner Shel Shabbat, to enjoy its light, to eat by it, to read by it. Indeed, these candles serve the functional purpose of all lamps and lights, to enable one to escape from darkness and enjoy his work. It is a useful light, meant to illuminate our quarters on the Shabbos. However, Ner Hanukkah was declared unusable and unenjoyable. Asur le'ishtamesh le'orah. One must not use the Ner Hanukkah for identification of objects, nor may one eat, read, or do work by its light. It is holy, untouchable by and inaccessible to man. The Hanukkah light is intrinsically unique, different from all other lamps. There is no pragmatic purpose pursued by its lighting. It is rather a cultic, ceremonial, symbolic object. The symbolism of the Ner, the candle, is in general a double one. First, the Ner is a lamp that illuminates and makes things visible. Second, it is a guide in darkness, does not dissipate the darkness. The sun, for example, illuminates. A remote star neither illuminates nor shines. However, it does guide. The star may be 1,000 times bigger and more brilliant than the sun, yet it does not shine because of the enormous distance separating the star from us. It twinkles from a mysterious far horizon, winks to us, and tells us something we don't understand. Ner Shabbat represents the Ner HaMa'or, the light of illumination, the shining light enjoyed by many, which brilliantly lights up the whole house. Ner Hanukkah is a Ner HaNir'eh Merachok, a remote light. The distant light attracts us, pulls us. We run after it, hoping to come near, yet the closer we come, the quicker it moves away from us. The twinkling star is perceived but not enjoyed, seen but not used. In terms of physical distance, the Ner Hanukkah is close to us. We can touch it. Yet psychologically, it is as remote from us as the flying nebulae on the outskirts of the universe. Ner HaMa'or symbolizes clarity, rationality, openness, and frankness. That's the Ner of Shabbat. It represents a stage in life at which man has no questions and no problems. His life is straightforward and simple. Rationality is interwoven into the very texture of an enjoyable life. In a word, Ner HaMa'or symbolizes man's great capacity for understanding and rationalizing. Ner HaNir'eh Merachok symbolizes the endlessness of the cosmos, its uncharted lanes along which stars are born and perish, come into being and explode. The human eye cannot encompass the distances. One's intellect cannot penetrate the flying nebulae. Of course, man sees a light, a twinkling star. It tells him that the cosmos is the abode of the infinite will, and that everything, every particle, every microscopic phenomenon, as well as the world in toto, is guided by an infinite and omnipotent intelligence. The distant stars bear witness that the divine harmony and cosmic peace prevail throughout creation. So in his very, very unique way, Rav Soloveitchik notes how, and he compares the Ner of Hanukkah to the guiding star. The star is something we can't benefit from. It doesn't necessarily provide us the light that the moon and the sun provide for us, but yet it guides us. It shows us the direction where we want to go. And that, on some level, is what Nerot Chanukah are meant to be. On the one hand, we're not allowed to benefit from them. We're not allowed to use them for our purposes. But when we stare into those Nerot Chanukah, they're meant to be that guiding light showing us where we want to get to. Perhaps you could suggest, it doesn't say this, it represents the Nerot of the Beit HaMikdash, the Nerot of the temple, which we know the Chanukiah is meant to be patterned after the menorah of the Beit HaMikdash. And it provides us that guiding light in a beautiful way, showing us where we're hoping to get to, what we're striving for. And some in Chazal say, compare the Nerot Chanukah, the light of the Nerot of Chanukah, to the Or HaGanuz. Again, this is a Kabbalistic idea, but to the light that God had hidden during the 7 days of creation. On some level, it's that light that we can't touch, we can't access, but yet we look at and it guides us in our lives. And so, far from just being a standard halacha, oh, we just can't use these candles. When we focus on Hanerot Halalu Kodesh Hein Ve'en Lanu Reshut L'Hishtamesh B'hem, there's many beautiful lessons that emerge from that halacha, which is why I believe we stress it as we're lighting those candles every single night on Hanukkah. Hopefully, the things that we've discussed today give us a lot of food for thought as we enter the Chag of Hanukkah. Wishing everybody a wonderful, wonderful Hanukkah Sameach.